So thank you so much to Matt and Compass for inviting me, and thanks so much to Amy Luff for spending quality time helping me think through this presentation for tonight, and then also giving a training tomorrow morning. A lot of what I'm going to do tonight is kind of thinking big. We're going to think big for an hour or so. And tomorrow is where I'm going to kind of get more into the weeds, the technical weeds. So if you're looking more for that, then I encourage you to come back tomorrow morning. So just a caveat, this is part of a new presentation that we're putting out into the world. And we had some technical snafus, so I'm going to kind of adapt. So just bear with me. This is a new presentation, and I'd love your feedback afterward. I did make some adjustments to make it particular to you all and your region. So I hope you get something out of it. And I also want to thank Tom Laws with Compass, who also spent a lot of time kind of helping me prepare for this and think through what your kind of local circumstances and issues are. And we were at the International Trail Symposium last week in Dayton, Ohio, so we got to spend some time talking about Treasure Valley, and that was really helpful. So let's get started. And I welcome you, because we're such a small group. Please kind of get my attention, throw your hand up at me, and jump in with questions so that it's not all pent up till the end. And I'd love to have more of a conversation as we go. So as Matt mentioned, we're going to talk about the unrealized potential of trail networks and active transportation as economic development. Oftentimes, you kind of hear those things sort of tangentially connected to each other, but I want to paint a vision for the future where they're going together much more seamlessly. So a little bit about Rails to Trails Conservancy. We are 31 years old. We were formed in 1986. We're a 501c3 nonprofit. We have about 45 staff. We have our headquarters office in Washington, D.C., and we have 4 field offices, and we have growing satellite offices off of those field offices. And you'll learn a little bit later in the presentation about why that growth is happening. But ultimately, this is our mission. We're dedicated to creating a nationwide network of trails from former rail lines and connecting corridors to build healthier places for healthier people. So what I'm going to go through today is some history, a little bit of transportation history and how that transportation history connects to the Rails to Trails movement and the active transportation movement more largely. Then I'm going to talk about the economic opportunity of trail networks, and then I'm going to talk about how some of this work is taking place in what we call our very wonky name right now, soon to be renamed in the near future, but for now we're calling it our Projects of National Significance, that we're rooting in 8 different regions across the country. And so I'll pull out some specific examples of this work, and then, like I said, Q&A throughout. So I want to take you way back to start. So this is 1830. This is the Tom Thumb, America's first steam locomotive. It traveled from Baltimore to Ellicott City, Maryland at the amazing speed of 18 miles per hour. And by 1850, this disruptive technology was at the center of American life. In 1869, the Transcontinental Railroad was completed, linking this vast North American continent from coast to coast. The first transportation revolution had occurred, and the age of the railroad was in full bloom. So in 1916, there were 250,000 miles of active railway on the ground, this incredible number. This is looking at it in 1918, so similar numbers. You can see this is the entire network across the country. But there was this other disruptive technology that was starting to occur. It was the automobile. With time, automobiles became ubiquitous, leading to the demise of railroads and America's second transportation revolution. So I kind of want to walk you through this change and how it brought Rails to Trails into being. So in the 50s and 60s, with the rise of the Federal Highway Act, railroads faced increasing competition from trucking companies. And so as that change occurred and ICC regulations made it difficult for the railroads to compete, railroads started to go out of business. In 1970, nearly a quarter of the nation's 250,000 miles of railroad were being operated under bankruptcy. And then in 1980, the Staggers Rail Act passed. This deregulated the railroads and made it much easier for railroads to abandon lines, allowing them to become much more competitive. This really triggered a mass wave of railroad abandonments, and abandonments were happening between 4,000 to 8,000 miles per year. So in 1983, there was some people around the country, some of our founders and also folks in Congress started to realize that these were valuable corridors that had really been there since the beginning and that they were going to be lost. And so they started to get together and they passed what's ultimately the National Trail System Act, which allowed the federal government to regulate the disposition of these soon-to-be abandoned corridors. And they established this process known as rail banking. So that brings us to today, where there's about 140,000 miles of active railroad operated by 7 Class 1 railroads. And really, it's from this National Trails Act that took place in 1983 and this opportunity of these abandonments that the Rails to Trails movement and thus the Rails to Trails Conservancy in 1986 was born. So I want to do some interactive trail trivia with you all to kind of understand where we are at today. So does anyone want to take a guess at how many miles of rail trails do you think there were in 1986 when this movement was getting started?
Very little.
Take a gander at a number.
2,000.
2000's high, really high.
So you mean how many of these rail lines have been turned into trails?
Yeah, so how many rail trails, how many miles of these trails do you think exist
100.
in 1986? Sorry?
100.
You're really close, so it was 250. Okay, so that's what we started with. Today, without cheating, in case anyone's looked at the numbers online, how many miles of rail trails do you think there are nationwide today?
10,000.
There's more than that, but that's a good guess. Anyone else want to guess? Tom, you want to guess?
20,000.
So yeah, so we're at about 22,000 miles of rail trails across the country. And then looking at these stats in another way, there's about almost 2,000 open rail trails, so individual rail trails, and about 780 rail trail projects, which projects we use that as a word to say kind of things that are in development, things that are under either going through design and construction or construction, and those are just the ones we know of. It's hard to kind of be in touch with every single thing going on, but that's a lot, right? And then the mileage that goes with that is kind of unknown at this point, but we're constantly kind of tracking as they come online, keeping track of these numbers. So this transition to this movement, this Rails to Trails movement, really wouldn't have been possible without the commitment and hard work of people all across the country. This spread into a movement. It didn't all happen by Rails to Trails Conservancy. It happened by folks all over the country, folks like you who learned how to do this. RTC was providing technical assistance in the early years, and really just this understanding of this rail trail movement spread. And so this is the network that we have today. This is what it looks like when you go on our Trailfinder website, traillink.com. So I want to go back in the past to spotlight a prescient moment. This is a quote by one of our co-founders, Peter Harnick, and he said, in 1965, Rails to Trails was still a highly localized movement. People said, we've got this abandoned railroad track, so let's use it. Only gradually did there emerge a realization that America desperately needs a national trail system, and that unused rail corridors are the perfect backbone for that network. So I want you to kind of keep this idea that early on, there was this prescient moment thinking ahead into trails as trail systems and trail networks as we go through the rest of this talk. So we were talking about disruption and how that brought the Rails to Trails movement, and I want to transition to talking about how we're living in another time of disruption and the opportunities that is going to bring to us. So this is 1939. This is the General Motors. They introduced this vision to the world that promised convenience, independence, happiness, all via the automobile. They did this at the World's Fair in New York City, at GM's Futurama exhibit. And they really put out this idea of a suburban utopia designed around the car and connected to a national network, but instead a network of highways. And so instead of fitting automobiles into our traditional communities, this was a future where our communities would be built around the automobile. So in post-World War II, there was this prosperity that fueled rapid suburbanization of America. Many people fled the city in pursuit of this suburban happiness. And the way that suburbs were designed, as you know, created long distances between home, work, school, play, shopping, and driving became the practical way that we all got around. Before that, this wasn't a reality that was part of our country. So by 1946, we had fully entered the age of the automobile. We weren't quite yet at the 14 superlane highways that GM predicted, but the automobile had become central to our culture. As this era of the automobile blossomed, we learned that this wasn't necessarily utopia. Highways cut through towns and cities and isolated entire segments and neighborhoods, disconnecting communities. Cars became the dominant mode of transportation, and quality of life suffered. This is an image in Miami. This was a prominent African-American neighborhood that called Overtown that was, you can see, severed into different quadrants by the highways coming through. So for more than 70 years, automobiles have been the predominant mode of transportation for the majority of places in this country. It's really hard, I think, for me, even as an urban planner, to imagine something new and what that might look like. But this vision that at Rails to Trails we're talking about now, we're calling it the age of connectivity, both for its genesis and for its potential, for its origins in technology and for the opportunities it creates to connect people like never before. And so there's several significant factors that are contributing to this. One is we're seeing a change in driving trends. Our driving behavior suggests that cars might not be as central to our lives as they once were. For the first time in 60 years, total vehicle miles driven began to level off in 2004. This was due to the recession, rising gas prices, but it doesn't appear that driving is increasing at the same rate that it once was. If you look at changes in young adults' travel patterns between 2001 and 2009, you can see that young adults are far less reliant on cars than their parents. They're driving less. They want to live in walkable, bikeable places with trails. And personal car ownership is no longer a quintessential teenage rite of passage. Those of you who have kids might be observing this as well. And if we look in older populations, even older Americans are driving less. At least 1 in 5 who are over the age of 65 are not driving. Also, this population wants to be in more walkable places for as long as possible. And the other disruption that is important to note is that we're technically more connected than we've ever been. Almost every single person in this country has either a smartphone or a mobile phone, which is incredible if you think about it. So there's a couple trends that are coming from this. One is this idea of the sharing economy. And so some of the most obvious examples that apply to what we're talking about are ride sharing and bike share. This kind of growth is due to a number of factors. One is that the digital technology is now ubiquitous. Another is the undeniable convenience of quickly accessing on-demand service. The rapid sharing economy, particularly ride sharing, will continue because economics will change patterns of car ownership. And if we consider the rise of the autonomous vehicles, this is another shift that potentially might change how we plan our cities and communities. So what does this mean? If we start to think differently about places and how the automobile might be changing and how our infrastructure needs might be changing, this is also part of this age of disruption and allows us to really think about our places and new opportunities about how we think about our roads. I don't know about you, but even being trained as an urban planner, the way I grew up in a suburb of Chicago, I always kind of thought as, streets are for cars. They're only for cars. And it isn't really until recently, until a lot of these shifts have started to happen, and I started to think about how I choose to spend my time and live my life, and have seen planning changes happen really rapidly. Where I live, for example, in Washington, D.C., they start to think about how infrastructure could be different. It doesn't necessarily have to be the way it is. So with this trend, there's a couple other stats that are important to note. Most of us pay tens of thousands of dollars for vehicles that are idle about 95% of the time. On average, cars are only driven 3.7% of the time. The rest of the time, you're either parked or looking for parking or sitting in traffic. And where cars are in use 95% of the time and parked less than 4% of the time. So this is valuable space that's being taken for cars to be parked when they're not even being used, right? And so that's taking up space in our infrastructure as we know it. So since the rise of the age of the automobile took hold in 1946, the car has been this main mode of transportation. But we can start to think differently about this. We could potentially have a balanced transportation system, one built around people. You might still choose to use a car, you may not, but the idea is that you will have more choices. And the menu of options available will include not just cars, but in the way that our space presents itself from these shifts that I was just talking about, allows for us to proactively plan for how we use existing corridors, including roads and including abandoned corridors like railroads, even how we think about utility corridors. That's something that we're looking at Rails to Trails. So this might sound like pie in the sky, and like I'm a crazy lady standing here telling you this, but let's try to think about it. So I want you to indulge me for a minute. I want you to close your eyes. I want you to imagine, I don't want to see them all closed. Close them. I want you to imagine it's the year 2030. It's not that far away. You're traveling through your hometown. You immediately notice that the streets are different. There are no cars parked on the street. The only cars present are autonomous vehicles in their designated lanes. The roadway has been redesigned to include a trail, totally separated from cars. It's used by pedestrians and cyclists of all ages and abilities. As you ride or walk, I should say, you see ample green space, prosperous businesses, and lots of community activity. The town is literally buzzing with people. What you are imagining is a future in a healthy, thriving community that has put trails at the center of its life. You can open your eyes. Thanks for indulging me. So this scenario where trails and active transportation is at the heart of a healthy, thriving community isn't necessarily a futuristic concept. Places that want to be competitive and attract a highly skilled workforce or retain folks are implementing innovative strategies to improve quality of life and the quality of the community, and it's working. Some of the country's largest and most innovative companies like Google, Apple, and Under Armour are investing in these walkable, bikeable, trail-centric communities for their staff, but also for the communities. And where the old model used to be about, yeah, let's have this great campus, but let's only think about our campus. One thing that's really been changing the last couple of years, and you see this with Amazon as well in Seattle, is that these campuses are thinking, they're still thinking about the connectivity within their campus for these corporate places, but they're also seeking better ways to more physically connect with the community and be integrated as part of the overall active transportation network. So this is really a notable shift. This is an image from South Baltimore. The owner of Under Armour, Kevin Plank, has a development company that bought up this huge amount of land on the water, and so this is the campus, and these are all the kind of connections within the campus, and then also you see the connections going into the rest of the city. So I want to talk about some real-world examples of where this is happening and how it's playing out. This is the Indianapolis Cultural Trail, and it's really, you wouldn't necessarily think of this kind of amenity in downtown Indianapolis, right? This is kind of a Rust Belt, rural place. There aren't many other cities for driving distance within several hours. You wouldn't think that this kind of project could take place, but I'll show you in a minute how it came into being. And the numbers that they have generated show that the potential of this trail is that it could generate more than $3 million in economic impact. And nearly half of the businesses located near the trail have reported an increase in revenue that they credit to trail users. And for these reasons, this trail has garnered a lot of attention and some national attention. I don't know if you're familiar, the last several years, the New York Times does this 52 places to go in the year ahead. So in January, they usually put out this list. And in 2014, Indianapolis was on the list. And the headline for the reason why was the cultural trail. And so I think the fact that they choose places from all over the world that represent a diversity of places. Growing up in Chicago, I would never guess that Indianapolis would be on this list, but I think it's because of this kind of infrastructure investment and how it's changed the culture in the city and how it's drawn people in, both for people who live there and the kind of businesses they can attract, but also for tourists, right? And wanting to come see this great amenity because it's really state of the art. And so I am going to play you a short video that gives you an idea of what this looks and feels like in Indianapolis.
Our entertainment venues, a number of historic places in downtown Indianapolis.
It feels different when you're riding a bike. I mean, it's just a different feel to it because of how it's been built and what's underneath it. So, but it's the part of that connecting up everything that's really made it dramatic and is getting the international attention.
The great thing about the Indianapolis Cultural Trail is that it's a really pretty high quality trail. The pavers are really tight interlocking pavers. I was actually very questionable when they said, oh, you'll be fine on a bicycle. I thought you'd feel it. The bioswales are incredible, the plantings on it, the signage. I mean, everything, just the greatest detail.
The vast majority of the trail has these bioswales and these stormwater planters. All the landscaping on the trail actually serve as a natural barrier protecting the cyclists and pedestrians from both vehicle traffic and from each other. Some places on the trail, it's a separated section where the bicyclists have one path of the trail and the pedestrians have the other side.
To really make people use it, we felt like it had to be big, bold, capture people's imagination. It was about changing the way people thought about walking and running and jogging. We had to create a new kind of place to grab and change behavior. We couldn't just do a bike lane and change behavior. We had to create a new street.
Thoroughfares downtown are huge. Everything's got 12-foot lanes. We pinched lanes and scooched the curbs over to steal space to build the trail. Every once in a while we stole little parking spaces.
The overall cost was $63 million, and there were no local tax dollars put into that. We had the Glick family who gave us $15 million, and then Brian fundraised some other money. One of the linchpins for finishing the project was we received one of the first Tiger grants, and we got $20.5 million, and that enabled us to finish the last 3 segments.
We knew that the city didn't have any money, and that if I had to wait for the city to have money, this project would never happen. So we started with philanthropy. And we were able to raise money because we didn't talk about this as an infrastructure project. We talked about it as a quality of life and an economic development project.
There's a big debate raging about transit and more transportation and more options for people. You'll never go wrong providing people transportation options. You won't.
This cultural trail has represented an influx, and it's yielded an influx of business interests, and we're seeing businesses who are willing to make investments, not only to put Hoosiers back to work, but to help create and expand Indianapolis' brand and image as a world-class city.
You go down to the Fountain Square area, and that used to be kind of a blighted street. Now it's just the cultural trail. As it was being built, not necessarily finished, as it was being built, you could see the development around that street.
All this development right here, this used to be a brownfield, a vacant lot. These 2 abandoned buildings down here are now full with businesses that have actually both expanded in the 2 years they've been in there.
I feel like the completion of the trail has helped Fletcher Place, Holy Rosary, Fountain Square have really taken off in the last year. Gives it more of a neighborhood city feel, which Indianapolis lacks in a lot of areas, but the trail has helped tremendously.
Indianapolis has made a huge commitment to infrastructure and improving the infrastructure for cyclists. So we now have the cultural trail, we've added bike lanes, and those bike lanes and the cultural trail all connect to other trails and other infrastructure that allow cyclists to ride to places.
Traditionally, Indianapolis has about 50 miles of existing greenways, and so what's great about the cultural trail and how it circulates in the inner city is that we're able to have separate spurs like the one down Virginia Avenue that will bring us within a quarter mile of that greenway, and then we're able to put in protected facility to get people from that greenway to here. So we really wanted to make sure that all the users felt comfortable, felt protected. We used the green paint here on all of the ingresses and egresses. Those are concrete underneath those casings. It's not just a plastic flex post. So this is actually an example of where the cultural trail tries to incorporate art, functional art. So this is a bus shelter that provides shelter and light. And actually, when the sun is correct, these words from this poem are projected onto the ground. There was, I believe, $2 million worth of commissioned art all along the trail, and some of it functional and some of it just aesthetic.
The safety of the trail, is paramount. We're going to bring 1 million people and run them down the street every year, and to decrease the opportunities to have conflicts between vehicles and pedestrians or vehicles and bikes. We did things like all the little streets, we raised the level of the street to be at the level of the trail. So instead of dropping down and crossing the street has to climb up and cross the trail.
Crosswalks are done with a product called Duratherm, and basically what happens is you heat up the asphalt, and then this is like a stamp, and it stamps in, and then you lay in this thermoplastic, and then when it cools, it's level with the street so our snowplows don't hit it, but it provides a really great visuals for cars so that they know that they're approaching a special space.
We put up a lot of signage because this is different. We put up instructions to the motorists that they have to yield to the pedestrians on the trail. We put up signs for the trail users because there really aren't rules of the road for this.
We're trying to get people excited about commuting and thinking about commuting. And so here at the hub, we've got BGI right behind us, so any maintenance needs your bike may need. And then also if you need equipment or gear, they're here. And on the other side is the Y part, and that's what's convenient is to have showers and towels. So after you bike to downtown to work, we get you all cleaned up, have amenities for you, keep your clothes while you're at work, and then you come back and you can ride home.
It draws people back to downtown, it gets people out of their cars, it gets people participating, just in street life, and it's been a lot of fun to watch.
And you see people going up and down it all day. Weekends are heavier, but people are constantly using it.
People are commuting to work, they're running errands on their bicycles, people are doing lots of leisure rides, they're riding to dinner, riding to get coffee with friends, riding to lunch.
So when the mayor was elected in 2007, we really had 0 miles of on-street bike lanes, and this year with projects just getting ready to start up, we've got about 70 to 75 miles of existing on-street bike lanes. The mayor ultimately wants, back in 2015, a bike network, so greenways and on-street bike lanes, a network of 200 miles.
You can never do it alone, so you always have to get all of your ideas.
Hopefully that gives you a feel for how game-changing this piece of infrastructure and linking it to the rest of the trail network there has been so impactful for a place like Indianapolis. So I want to share a couple other quick examples before I get more into the meat with you on some other places that you wouldn't necessarily expect that are prioritizing these kinds of trails and active transportation networks. So this is the Miami Valley, which is the region around Dayton, Ohio. This is home to the largest paved network of trails in the country. So 340 miles of paved, interconnected trails around Dayton. So not necessarily the kind of place you would expect to have prioritized this, but it's been hugely impactful for their region. In Minneapolis, they've also prioritized biking and walking and trails, and it's really paying off. The city is consistently ranked as one of Bicycle Magazine's top places to bike, and a recent statewide economic impact study found that the bicycling industry generates $780 million in economic activity for the state of Minnesota in 1 year. That's for 1 year alone. The health impact of Minneapolis's walkable, bikeable community is striking. Biking in the city generates healthcare savings of $100 to $500 million annually. In Cleveland, they went after and received an $8 million Tiger Grant in 2016, and this is going to help to close key gaps in the city's 100-mile trail network, improving connectivity for tens of thousands of people. So what does this all add up to? We're looking at examples of cities that have really reimagined what the built environment looks like and prioritizing quality of life looks like. And it's really representing this cultural sea of change that's also pushing us into this age of connectivity. But for the future to be realized, we have to really go beyond cities. And we really believe at RTC that's what's happening in cities and regions can happen everywhere. We believe that trails are a catalyst for change and that the benefits trails can bring can be enjoyed in every type of place, rural, suburban, and urban. And in a few minutes, I'll show you some of our projects that are connecting those three types of landscapes. I'm going to skip ahead a little bit. So, the stat that we talked about at the beginning of the presentation, this map represents that 22,000 miles of trails and more than 30,000 miles of multi-use trails nationwide. The majority of these trails are well-loved and heavily used, but they really haven't been maximized to their full potential. They were really conceived of at the beginning of this movement as individual trails, not as pieces of these larger active transportation and trail networks. But with these thousands of miles on the ground, we really have this opportunity to fill the gaps, connect these trail systems, and get people where they want to go and be able to recreate, whether they're walking or biking, horseback riding, and this is really an opportunity to create a future where trail systems are at the heart of healthy, thriving communities, and where communities leverage these trails as part of their economic development strategies, as part of their attraction strategies, as part of placemaking, as part of revitalization, like you saw in Indianapolis, that to retain current residents, to attract new residents and new businesses. So, what kinds of outcomes are we looking at? We're looking at what kinds of transportation options and connections are made that give places a competitive edge. We're looking at creating these stronger businesses and economies, which I'm going to circle back to in a minute. Obviously, the health and wellness benefits that go along with having access to trails, a healthier environment provided by the green space, and probably most importantly is equitable access. Who gets to access this infrastructure? Is it equitably distributed? Is it really being intentionally planned for everybody? So I want to, like I said, I want to dive more into the economic piece. That's our theme. And these are a couple of photos from the Great Allegheny Passage you might have heard of. This is one of the most well-loved, totally separated multi-use trails. It connects Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania, down to Cumberland, Maryland, and ultimately from Cumberland you can get on the CMO Canal and you can take it all the way to DC. So essentially, this trail that took decades to build now provides a totally off-road multi-use trail experience from Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania to Washington, DC. So this has really become well known for generating economic activity along the small towns along this route. So if you can see this quote, The revival of the city is driven in part by the trail. No one thought people with bikes would spend money, but they were wrong. Business is spreading back from the trail. This is from the former mayor, of Cumberland, Maryland. So this is the one of the kind of main hubs along. This is the end technically of the Gap, but again, this is where you can connect over to the C&O Canal, so you can keep going down to DC. And if you go to Cumberland, you see this kind of former Rust Belt place that a lot of it has been revitalized, and they've rethought about some of the downtown elements and making it very inviting to trail users, and having very good signage and having kind of those local businesses, and it's really had an impact on the city. This is a quote from another small town. This is in Confluence, Pennsylvania, so this is between Cumberland, Maryland, and Pittsburgh. And the business owner of this bed and breakfast says, "If not for the trail, I don't know if I would have enough business to make this work. There's a lot happening here now with the trail. People are fixing up houses and starting businesses. Things are catching on." So this is a way of looking at trails as economic development, kind of from this rural economic development standpoint, which is a huge issue in our country right now, as rural places, a lot of them are struggling to kind of keep afloat, to attract visitors, to have a reason to. And so with the trail networks going from kind of these destination points, and you have small towns along the way, they can actually do intentional planning to capture those trail users and make it. This is the Great Allegheny Passage. I would encourage you, if you haven't done it, to really explore it. People come from all over the country to do this because you really can't do this anywhere else, where you're in a totally separated environment and you can just have this lovely experience of going from town to town and really not having that stress of being on road. And there's nothing like it. And so lots of places want to basically have this long distance trail. Another way to think about trails and economic development is this attraction of talent and also spurring of development. And so this picture on the left is called the Ice House. It's in Dallas, Texas. It's on the Katy Trail, and it's the highest grossing bar in Dallas. And so just think about that. I mean, this is a big, metropolitan city, and the highest grossing bar is on this trail. And they've actually had some issues because this trail has been such a powerful economic engine, and this quote here is looking at it very positively, but they've actually had issues where the costs of being along this trail have risen so high now from the desirability that there are issues with that. So that's another issue I'm not going to dive into today, but that's something else we look at, making sure that trails aren't sparking gentrification and pushing people out. And so that's something that we're really looking into. This is a quote from the Brookings Institute. Just really underscores the role of placemaking and infrastructure and how they go together. And so really looking at these trail networks and people wanting to live in places that support this kind of infrastructure and have it. I noticed that on the Economic Development Partnership for Treasure Valley, a lot of the pictures on the materials, the marketing materials, were people on bikes and people on trails. And so I think this, while it might seem like a soft notion, I think it really is becoming palpable. And so we are working on our next research agenda at Rails to Trails, and we're going to be working on how do we kind of quantify this talent attraction piece, because every place we're working, we're hearing about it, but it's so hard to put a number on that. So that's something we're going to be working towards in the next few years. And if you have any thoughts on that, I'm totally open to hearing them. Another way to think about this, you heard a little bit about this in the Indianapolis video at the Cultural Trail, where instead of the idea, the concept of transit-oriented development, where the idea is there's a transit corridor that's creating, kind of sparking development. You heard about it on the Cultural Trail, where because the trail was there, new businesses started to spring up. And not just businesses, there's other places, like in Houston, for example, a place that's not known for necessarily smart growth principles, but they have condos popping up along the trail. You see that in the Atlanta Beltline. You see that on the Minneapolis, blanking on the name right now, the major trail there. And so you see this trail-oriented development happening because of the presence of the trail. This doesn't typically happen organically. It happens with a lot of intentionality, and so I'll be talking about that a little more in depth tomorrow's training. This is a little really pretty graphic one of the staff at RTC made. this is of a corridor, kind of imagining a rail trail corridor in Baltimore. And there's already, the corridor's semi-abandoned right now, and there's already these kind of techie businesses opening along the semi-abandoned corridor. And so he basically took the profile of this and kind of imagined if you actually built out the trail, what this could start to look and feel like, where the road per se, or the drawing factor, is the trail itself that is connected to the rest of the trail network of the city. And I'll talk about that project in a few minutes. Okay. So I have to skip ahead. So back to kind of this age of connectivity. There's a lot of these changes that I've talked about. A lot of these things are going to be happening in the next 5, 10, 15 years, maybe sooner, maybe later, but we know it's happening. We can see all this in the news. And so there's kind of this optimistic scenario where we take matters into our own hands and we start to think differently about our places, and we think differently about the role that the way that roads are designed, the way that we integrate walking and biking and trails into our community. Or we could be passive and we could let these technological changes happen, and we could let biking and walking and trails kind of be an afterthought. We believe, obviously at RTC, that it's important to take a more proactive stance, and that's why we're putting forth this vision to put trails really at the center of these changes. And it's really through developing thoughtful, intentional trail and active transportation networks that weave together these different kinds of landscapes, cities, suburban, rural, that we're going to have this potential, totally different way that we're organizing where we live. So how are we going about this? We're looking at it from a kind of our three-legged stool. So there's three main things that we do. We have a policy shop, and so we look at federal, state, and local active transportation and trail policy and make sure that we're doing everything we can to preserve the federal policies that really preserve funding streams for trails, and looking at the state level, how much money is being appropriated to trails and active transportation, and trying to find different levers to increase those pots, as well as at the local level. On the project side, this is the part of the organization that I lead, and so I'm going to come to this section in a few minutes, but this is, again, these projects of national significance that we're pursuing, and I'll come back to that in a minute. And then the third part of this is trail use, and so this is really encouraging people to get out there, use the infrastructure that's there, so that they become champions for this infrastructure, so that they love it, so that they demand more in their communities, and they tell their elected officials, they tell their leaders that this is the kind of infrastructure they want. And so we have a free trail finding website called traillink.com, and you can go there, type in your zip code, type in your state, and you can see the trails near you. You can even download, make itineraries for yourself to go out and actually follow the different waypoints, see if there's a place to stop. We started making little itineraries if you want to go have a semi-long distance trip. So it's a great website to check out if you're not familiar with it, traillink.com. So back to the kind of the project side. I'm going to jump in here and tell you how this work relates. So really what these projects are an effort to work in different regions across the country. Right now we're working in 8 regions across the country, and it's really about changing, again, this paradigm that I've been talking about, where you take trails and active transportation from, gee, that's nice, I'm glad I have a trail in my backyard, to this is really an essential part of the place that I live and how I get around and how I live my life. So that's what we're trying to get to through, again, saying you have this rail trail spine, you have this multi-use spine, you have this bike lane, but how are you thinking intentionally about integrating it all together? So these are the places that we're working, and I'm going to walk you through each one. You can see we're kind of like light where you all are in the central and west central. So yeah, we're hoping to change that in the future. Our latest 2 projects are down there at the bottom in Texas and Florida, so I'll talk about those in a moment. So this is one of the first big projects we got involved in. It's called, oops, I didn't know this was on a timer, sorry. This is called the Circuit. It's in Metro Philadelphia. It's a 9-county region, and they have a vision of having 750 miles of integrated trails and active transportation infrastructure. This crosses through their MPO region, which goes through parts of Philly, but into parts of New Jersey as well as obviously Pennsylvania. And so their vision for this network is that when it's complete, more than 50% of the region's population, which is about 3.1 million people, are estimated to live within 1 mile of one of these trails. So that's really a game changer for this region. And I'm going to show you a much shorter video than the last one to give you an idea for how this network plays out.
Imagine a trail network connecting the entire Philadelphia region. That's the Circuit, an ambitious vision of over 750 miles of trails, linking cities, parks, and neighborhoods. It's a partnership of cities, towns, nonprofit organizations, citizens groups, agencies in Pennsylvania and New Jersey. And the best part is it's being expanded mile by mile, year by year.
I bike mostly for recreation. I live in Havertown, and I come down to the trail and go into the city and back out. Just a nice, safe place to ride my bike that doesn't get in a lot of traffic.
We just decided to come up to the trail and have a picnic and take a walk around. It's so close to museums that so many people get access to it. Right in the heart of the city, it's just a great trail.
We take long walks on Philly Drive, and he actually loves skateboarding, so we end up making our way down to Kings Park.
The skate park was actually built last year. It is cool actually have a skate park, not too many skate spots around here.
I am very impressed with New Jersey communities because especially that it is such an industrial state.
The Circuit is a community space, an enhancement to our neighborhoods that we can all share. As a community amenity, it improves quality of life and protects and enhances property values.
More than just a vision, this trail network is being created right now by knitting existing trails together with locally completed projects.
As of 2014, over 300 miles of trail have been completed, with many more miles in development. The Circuit vision covers the greater Philadelphia area and beyond, from southeastern Pennsylvania to central New Jersey.
I hope you'll join us by enjoying and supporting the Circuit.
These are all the organizations that are involved in this coalition. Okay. The next project I want to tell you about is where I live in Washington, D.C. This is a vision to also connect. We have some really great rail trails, some main National Park Service trails. We have a lot of federal land in and around Washington, D.C. So this is these is all the jurisdictions that immediately touch the District of Columbia is the immediate footprint that we're focusing on with our main partners, the Washington Area Bicyclist Association, and we're working with them to build a collaborative coalition of other nonprofit groups, the MPO, other government agencies, all the municipalities, economic development groups, business improvement districts. We're all working together to complete this vision of an interconnected trail network for the region. And so we've got about 300 miles right now, and we're working on our vision, but we think we can get up to 500 or 600 miles beyond that. And the powerful thing about doing it in our region is that we want it to be really high standards in terms of trail widths and quality of the trails, and demonstrating that we can not only partner with the municipalities, but also with the federal government through the National Park Service and all the land that they own, and make this as a demonstration project for all the congressmen who work in DC part of the year, and take this back to their districts and really show what's possible when you put some thought and funding and lots of planning into a game-changing trail network. In Baltimore, it's a little bit different. Our vision for that project is linking the current 3 Stream Valley trails that are already there. They're all Olmstedian vision trails that are already there. and connecting them into this 35-mile loop that connects 50 neighborhoods all around the city. And I think what's important about this is that you see a lot of segregation, a lot of inequality in Baltimore, and so what we're really working to do is make sure that this is a trail network that is equitably developed, that we're working hand in glove with a lot of the more segregated neighborhoods, the high poverty neighborhoods, and making sure that this meets outcomes that serve them. And so one interesting first element of this project is we worked with a community that's next to one of the big regional parks, and the low, primarily African American community sits kind of elevated from this regional park, and they can physically see what's going on in this park, but they're separated from it. If you harken back to the beginning of the presentation, from those separation of neighborhoods, it's separated by a 6-lane road. Really, it's more like a highway. And so the community can see other neighborhoods, more affluent neighborhoods, because they're on this hill accessing the park, but they're physically separated from this 6-mile road from it. And it's very dangerous. The timing of the signals is not good. And there's a lot of amenities in the park that the neighborhood likes to use. There's a pool, there's programming for kids, and it's right across from one of the main schools of the neighborhood. So that connection's really important. So we worked, we got an American Planning Association grant in partnership with the CDC called Plan for Health, and we worked hand in glove with that community, and we'll continue to do so even though the grant has ended. But we worked with them to really talk about the issues in the neighborhood and how connectivity could be better in the neighborhood itself, but also in connecting to these other assets through the trail and bike ped network. And then we worked with the community to do a demonstration event where we did a temporary crossing treatment to make the point to motorists and to the community that this was an important crossing and that this was for people. And so it was a great event. We were able to document it and show what that's like, so that the community can then use that. Hopefully we can keep doing more things like that and use it as an advocacy tool to really think about how does that intersection get treated in the future, especially when this is maybe where a future trail would go to connect to the rest of the network. So that's really really important work that we're really focused on right now. This network is a mega region. This connects all the Rust Belt cities. So if you think of Cleveland, Pittsburgh, Morgantown, West Virginia, this is a vision to connect those Rust Belt cities over 1,450 miles. And what's interesting about this project is that it came out of a regional economic development marketing initiative that was across these state boundaries. It was initially this horrible name called the Power of 32, so it just meant the power of these 32 counties that were across different states. And they had all these different initiatives going for workforce development, education, and then they had a quality of life initiative, and they decided that the quality of life initiative was going to be about trails. And what's amazing is that there were 2 major foundations in the large region that have backed this, and there's a coalition that's come together, spearheaded by National Park Service, Rails to Trails, and also the Pennsylvania Environmental Council. And then we pulled together all the trail groups, a lot of the economic development groups and elected officials from this huge mega region to form this coalition. We went through a branding and naming process to call it the Industrial Heartland Trails Coalition. And what's amazing is that this came out of this regional economic development initiative, but what we've been told by some of the early players of that initiative that spawned this is that this initiative is the furthest along. So it's doing much better than a lot of those other initiatives that came out of that. So I think that speaks to the power of what people see this can bring as values to these, again, a lot of the rural places in between, and the urban places as the kind of nodes, how this can be transformative. So about almost half of it is already there. So a lot of the pieces are there, and this is about how do we accelerate filling in those gaps to get to that 1,450 miles. So this is what it looks like. You can see Pittsburgh kind of in the middle, you go down to Parkersburg, Morgantown, West Virginia. That green line on the bottom right, that's the Great Allegheny Passage that I was telling you about earlier. So you can see when it gets down to that point in Maryland, that's Cumberland, and then when you curve around that panhandle, that's the C&O Canal that takes you all the way down to DC. So you see these are the kind of corridors, and a lot of what we're doing is forming coalition groups along these, what we call mega corridors. So we're getting together as working groups, kind of all the trail groups and all the players along from like Cleveland to Pittsburgh, Ashtabula to Pittsburgh, Parkersburg to Pittsburgh, and really focusing those people on regular work calls to work together and say, okay, what can we do to accelerate this forward? What's going on with your project? What's going on with ours? And really thinking out of the box in terms of how we can speed up the filling in the gaps. And then now we're starting to think more together about how do we think about trail towns, like I was talking about earlier? How do we think about bringing in rural economic development to these places, and thinking about tourism as the main draw for this? So we're just starting to get into that this year, and I think next year we'll get further. And there's some early studies that we've done on studying some of the businesses, and so I'm going to talk about some of those tools tomorrow at the technical training. This is the Route of the Badger. What's fabulous about this, it's in southeast Wisconsin, so it connects these two metropolitan regions of Milwaukee and Racine. They're very urban in the Milwaukee and Racine part, but then quickly get into suburban and rural areas. So that's, I think, what's so powerful about this. They have some critical amount of trails on the ground already that have been invested in over a long period of time, and pretty much like these routes have presented themselves. So this is kind of what we were looking at a few years ago, and it's not hard to imagine, you know, where these gaps get filled in. The green lines are what's there, what's already open, and so you can start to see this loop forming up there. You see these long distance connections. This town down here, Burlington, is a smaller town, and they're already thinking there about how do they become a trail town, how do they bring people in. Being from Chicago myself, lots of Chicago people like to come up to southern Wisconsin for long weekends and vacations, and so it's really, I think part of it is an equity strategy, especially in Milwaukee, another very segregated city. How do you make an active transportation network there that really serves the whole population? But then as you get into the suburban and rural, how do you frame that in a way that bolsters bringing those tourism dollars? And Wisconsin is a big, big bicycling and outdoor rec state. They have a big bicycling kind of economic cluster there that they've been studying. So there's already kind of this culture, and so it's really just about taking assets that are pretty much there and kind of wrapping the bow on it to finish it. So they thought about a little over 300 miles on the ground, and there's potential again to get over 500, 550. The Bay Area Trails Collaborative, this is in the Bay Area of San Francisco, and this is really a network of